Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to The Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora itiwi and welcome into The Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey for The Kaka with co-host Peter Bale with the most gorgeous lantern right behind you.
Oh,
today.
that's kind of you, Bernard. Yeah, well, I'm big on lanterns. My house has quite a few, and I keep accidentally buying the odd one every now and then. And I need to get over the habit of buying mid-century modern furniture. I think more and more bits of it.
So you won't be going to the IKEA opening on December
No, I
whatever
will
it is?
not be going to the IKEA opening. I do like IKEA for certain things, and I probably will go for towels and things like that, Bernard. That's what I used to do in Europe, but we'll see how that goes. And I think, of course, it's going to fill a huge gap in the New Zealand retail market. Maybe I won't have to go to Briscoe's anymore.
Well, yeah, I do wonder about, Briscoe's and the warehouse, how they're going to cope. But
Warehouse hasn't been coping very much with anything lately, has it? It's not looking terribly good. And Bernard, you're looking fabulous. I hear you've been for a swim today and a run.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's a good day. That's a good day's exercise.
I'm feeling very worthy. And
Yes.
I'm also feeling like my main aim in life now is to avoid dementia, or if I get it, to be slow. And
To slow it down, you mean?
Yeah. So I've been, doing lots of reading and listening and about, being fitter and doing more exercise and exercising my brain and all of that.
Well,
and
we'll be like Putin and Xi and able to live until we're 150.
My goodness.
Without our pancreas replacements and glands.
There will be a Hoon in 2043 when the climate has warmed by, 2.5 degrees and there's a megastorm every 3 minutes.
That's something to look forward to, Bernard.
Well, I'll be fine.
And shall we talk about what we're going to do today? We're going to start with a media story, a little bit of a media story, which is this intervention by the Broadcast Standards Authority, and we're going to look at the death very briefly of Jim Bolger, and I'm going to recount a couple of anecdotes, and hopefully an old colleague of mine is going to be on as well. And then you're going to do a little bit of a soliloquy, and we're going to have a discussion about international economics, the US dollar, and why we all need to think about the scale of the AI-driven blip in.
Yes. No, some really big questions like, do I trust the money being issued by the world's central banks, and do I think that the world's stock markets actually are a fair reflection of the companies on them,
of true value,
or whether they're just a vehicle for governments to funnel money to the rich? So,
and we're going to we're going to have Professor Robert Patman on. We'll talk a little bit about Gaza, the hostages, and my view that the whole thing this week is a sham. Not the release of the hostages, of course, but that this alleged peace deal is a sham. And then hopefully he will disagree with that. I think we might have a couple of stoushes today, Bernard. And then you want to talk quite a bit about the decisions on the government about methane emissions and some more sort of retraction on our commitments.
Yeah, that's what I call performative climate politics 101, which is you say you're doing the right thing and then everything you do is not the right thing. And we've had a bunch of those things, the methane changes, but also the government's acknowledged that it's not going to do things that get us to 1.5, which is the whole point of Paris. And we'll talk with Christina Hood and Catherine Dyer in a slot between 5:40 and 5:50. And towards the end of the show, instead of at the normal time of sort of 5:10, just to give us some breathing space on this climate stuff, which has been big this week.
And people always love Catherine's input and often ask for more Catherine. That's what they want. So should we talk briefly about this, the Broadcasting Standards Authority, which has made a really rather extraordinary move. Now, I may loathe virtually everything that Sean Plunkett does and stands for, and I often think of him having a sort of daily delivery of fresh bile to spew. But he is an experienced journalist and commentator, and I think the BSA's possibly chosen the wrong one to go after, or at least this amounts to me to be an extraordinary extension of its remit, because the Broadcasting Standards Authority, the word broadcast is in its name. It isn't. I just went through the 1989 Broadcasting Act. There's no reference in there, although it does. It's really about the radio waves, and the premise of any government regulation of broadcasters and radio and television has always been on the basis that they use publicly owned spectrum. That's always. It hasn't been about the First Amendment or the lack of it, or it hasn't been about hate speech. It's been about the fact that they use publicly owned spectrum, and that's how you get the acceptance of the idea of state regulation of broadcasters and so on. And I don't think that applies to platform, because it's broadcast because it's on the internet. And it isn't using public spectrum. But I think this is going to be a really interesting test case. The one sensible thing I thought from the head of the Broadcasting Standards Authority today was her comment that really they actually do want the government and politicians to decide whether they have the remit. But as far as she was concerned, if it looks like radio, sounds like radio, it probably is radio. But I think that's really going to be contested. And Bernard, the good thing about this is that you disagree with it. You disagree with me on this, I think.
Yes, not violently, but definitely. I think that what we are doing right now, Peter, is broadcasting. We are streaming to whoever wants to dial in.
Yes, but they're choosing to come, which is a different thing.
Well, whenever you turn on your radio, you're choosing to come. And whenever you turn on your TV or flick from one channel to another, you are choosing to come. Just the same when you choose to put a URL into your browser. And or when, for example, you are getting automatically pushed the podcast episode, or you happen to be on a particular website and it pops up and the algorithm says, hey, you should watch this or read this.
True, but
this.
When you get pushed the podcast, you've actually said you want to be notified when it's available. So it's in a sense it's a push me pull you.
Oh, very good. I am really excited about this, Peter, because it raises the prospect that finally our government, our protector, our organizer, our creator of sanity and of order, is going to look at the health and safety of our modern airwaves, which is the internet, and in particular social media. So if the government and the Broadcasting Standards Authority decide that the internet is actually broadcasting, bring it on, because then you start looking at Facebook, you start looking at YouTube, you start looking at all the other avenues for information, vitriol, social harm, the whole caboodle. And that's when, okay, well, let's regulate Facebook. Let's regulate YouTube. Let's regulate Telegram and the likes, as it should be. I'm way past the point of
but
being
it's not
nice
going to
about
happen.
this.
It's not going to happen, is it?
Well, just saying it's not going to happen simply means you're giving
Well, I'm
up
a
to
bit
the inevitable.
fatalistic about. I am a bit fatalistic about this, but
We only currently have, I think, 3 optic fiber cables into this country. On the afternoon of the Christchurch attacks, 2 degrees, Spark and Vodafone, One New Zealand, looked seriously at turning off Facebook because of the awful harm that was being done to their customers by Facebook and Google to an extent. Facebook's metastasization of the horrible images from the live streaming of the Christchurch attackers, live streamed video of his attacks, which was a perfectly legitimate thing to do. It can be done. It should be done. And I have no sympathy whatsoever with the likes of Sean Plunkett who say, somehow we're different.
I'm almost entirely disagree with you. It also turns out, as our friend Gavin Ellis reminded me today, that quite some time ago, the Media Council, which is the self-regulatory aspect um, for news publishers or publishers in New Zealand, actually set up a special part of the Media Council, which has now been absorbed inside the main Media Council, and it is responsible for potential breaches, even by TVNZ on its website. So they've tried to address this. So maybe the platform actually could be covered by the Media Council, but unlike the platform, the Hoon, the Kaka, your Substack, is actually registered with the Media Council, correct?
That's right. If someone wants to make a complaint about their content that's on the Kaka or on the Hoon or anywhere in between, they are welcome and able to lodge a complaint with the Media Council, because I have paid my dues to be a member of the Media Council, and that means I'm subject to its laws and controls. And happy to take that responsibility.
Yep, good on you.
Freedom
so I don't
should
think
come
this
with
is gonna happen.
responsibility.
I think it's really interesting that Winston Peters and David Seymour have plunged into it.
I hope we'll see
that
this.
there is a really healthy government discussion about this. I would say that the likelihood is that Christopher Luxon will scuttle away and say that it is in fact nothing to do with the Broadcasting Council or the Broadcasting Authority, or that we'll wait for it. Now, shall we move to Jim Bolger?
Yes.
Who died today. And we're going to bring in, if that's all right, Bernard, my old friend, very important mentor of mine, Bruce Conn.
Yes.
Who's in the green room.
Unfortunately, I think he's just jumped off. So you might need to quickly text him or something to get him back on. He might have waited for a bit and then decided
I did tell him he might have to wait for a moment, but
that's okay. While you're doing that, I will talk about my anecdotes of Jim Bolger. So I'm 58. So most of his time as in modern politics, I wasn't really involved. However,
you were
from 1992 to 1994, I was working as a journalist for Reuters in Wellington, and he was the Prime Minister at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did get to have a chat with him, be in press conferences and the likes. And then after his time when he left, I did do a couple of interviews about his change of heart on the issue of neoliberalism and his views. And I found him very engaging, thoughtful, and modest, actually. It's not often that former prime ministers admit they get things wrong or that they should have done things differently. And I admired him for that, because there aren't that many who do that.
Yeah, thank you. Here's Bruce. Now, let me introduce Bruce Conn. Bruce was my boss for a while at the Evening Post in Wellington, and in about 1873, and a very important mentor. It's easy to see. It's certain to say I wouldn't have had the overseas career that I've had without Bruce's backing, and I learned a lot from him. One of the things that I rang him about today was because he was a good mate, really, a good reporting mate of Jim Bolger's. Bruce, it's great to have you on. Tell us, you got a couple of good anecdotes, one from something over Scotch in Wellington, remember we have some in the audience are probably under 70, so they may need a reminder about who George Gere was as well.
Well, a lovely little story there was at the time that Jim Bolger failed to make the leadership of the National Party, excuse me, and having missed out, we then, I obviously was not in the caucus, but I retired with Jim to his room where a bottle of scotch was opened and we each imbibed. In the course of it, he asked me what he should do now. And my response was that if he was going to mount any comeback to get the leadership, then the first person he should speak to was a fellow by the name of George Gere, came from the North Shore, and was a very senior member of the National Party caucus at that time. It was years later, after Bolger was Prime Minister, that he confessed to me that when I told him he should recruit George Gere to his side, that the first person to come in after Macleay had won the leadership was George Gere.
Yeah.
Say, it's time for you to stand, mate.
Excellent. And there was another one, Bruce, that you will need to explain a little bit, because I asked you whether you were referring to Bolger being having had some scotch in this one, but it wasn't. You wrote something about him in Tokyo.
Yes, a little fun then. He had arrived from Moscow on a long, a 2-day, I think it was, trip to meet with the Japanese foreign minister. I interviewed him at the embassy residence soon after he got off the plane. He really was not coherent, but the embassy people took him off to meet with the Japanese foreign minister. When he got back, he later got from that paper of ours, Peter, the Evening Post, a story of mine which said that the foreign affairs people should never have let him go to that meeting because he was not in a fit state to go. He told me that I really should not be writing stories like that, and he wouldn't really want to see me too much for the rest of his stay there. In fact, I just left, went back to my hotel. Within 24 hours, he called up and said he was going to the fish market the next day, and perhaps I would accompany him.
Excellent.
And incidentally, I thought Bernard's review there of Jim was pretty jolly good. A lovely fellow, up there with Hollyoake as a smart politician.
And Bruce, we talked a little bit about this morning, and I was going to say something about this too. I will say this something when you've had your go. But what do you think Jim Bolger will be remembered for?
Probably most of all the treaty settlements, starting those with Doug Graham. Secondly, it's often forgotten, but he was the Prime Minister who set up the referendum on MMP. And I think that's too quickly forgotten, for better or worse.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Bruce. I'm just going to say, the thing that he was not Prime Minister when I was still working in New Zealand. David Longy, I think, was still Prime Minister when I left. But that decision to recognise the treaty properly, to start those negotiations, and that lovely line of his that he was going to do it because it was the right thing to do, for me is the biggest change that I saw after 40 years of being away and coming back. And it is a remarkable legacy that people right now are trying to undo in some rather extraordinary ways. I also had my anecdote from him is interviewing him in London once, and we were in his hotel and went up in the lift together, and he said, I've just come from John Major, who was the then Prime Minister. He said, he's marvellous, he's completely free of ideology, which in a sense Jim was as well.
I think one of the things which was extremely good for Jim in office was the fact that he had Doug Graham alongside him with the treaty settlements. Doug performed extremely well in that process.
And despite being something of a hard ass, he and Chris Finlayson had a bit of an epiphany about the situation of Maori in New Zealand, didn't they?
I think that's a fair comment, yes.
I wonder, Bruce, what he would have thought, or if you could compare and contrast, his National Party and national-led government, which was first past the post, but still, and the current national-led government, the current Prime Minister, who have taken quite a different stance on not just the economy, at least for now, but also treaty issues.
I think Bernard, you and Peter have been around long enough to see this, but in New Zealand there are a few members of Parliament who, in the success of their careers, would perhaps fit well into the House of Representatives in Washington. And I would put Jim Bolger among those, and probably Winston Peters, Richard Prebble, and certainly Mike Moore. Now, and Shane Jones is, I think, seeking to be on the way. But having said that, I just think that there is something in those men which, by contrast with Christopher Luxon, they were natural politicians. And the difference is here we have as a very successful businessman governing with a businessman's eye. And you could make a case that that is a very good time. This is a good time to have a businessman at the helm, but he's not a politician.
What did you think of his change of heart, if you like, in his later life, where he essentially said that neoliberalism had failed, and that he led the joint working group under Labor into our labour laws, and was the chair of Kiwibank under Labor. He was never a really hardcore tribal character, but also he was someone who was able to change his mind when the facts changed, I thought.
Yes, but he had something in him which people tended to forget, and that was his Irish background. And many of the Irish have a very strong political leaning, and he had that in spades.
Bruce, thank you so much for coming on. That's really good of you to do that.
Guys, just one more thought.
Yeah.
The other thing about Jim, I think, which was tremendous, was his wife. Throughout his career, she was extremely good and served him so well as Prime Minister, and in keeping pace with him through the various developments in his career, and looked after him superbly. Joan Bolger deserves a lot of praise for her.
Bruce, it's a very nice way to finish. Thank you so much for coming on, and
Thank
talk
you,
to you again
Bruce.
soon. Thank you for everything.
Thanks, Bernard. Thanks, Peter.
Cheers.
Now, Bernard, are we going to have time for a little bit of a soliloquy about the state of the markets and gold, or do you want to move it to the end? Is Robert in the green room?
He's not quite there yet, I think. Just a sneak preview of the thing at the end, because it looks like we are going to have about 5 or 10 minutes free at the end, as Christina can't make it for the whole section. She's only able to make it for the
let's
first
do
10
a
minutes.
fast rejig and do. Why don't you do a little warm up for your soliloquy?
Yeah. So every morning at 3 o'clock in the morning, I get up and have a look at the global financial markets. It's for my other gig, if you like, running 5 and 5 with ANZ. And so I'm interested in global financial markets. I always have been. I spent 10 years working overseas in financial reporting and economics reporting. Can't get it out of my blood. I'm really interested in this idea that the world's citizens, investors, savers trust money. Money as we think of it today, which essentially is a bunch of ones and zeros in bank accounts, backed up by central banks in various countries, with the US Federal Reserve as the big kahuna backing everything up with the US dollar, which is the world's reserve currency. And we are seeing something extraordinary at the moment. People are genuinely asking the question, do we trust this money? Do we think that the US Federal Reserve is independent, able to protect the value of this US dollar? Is it about to be beaten up like everyone else by Donald Trump and his cronies? Are we better off putting our money in something else than the US dollar? Should we put it into gold? And every morning for the last few mornings, it's gone up and up and up. It's up more than 50% this year. It is essentially what they're calling now in the rest of the world the debasement trade. This is the debasement of the world's reserve.
Debasement or debauchement? They're both about the same, but they're both about equal. So
yeah.
Is this the hedge on the taco trade?
Yes. I mean, the taco trade is quite interesting. So taco, Trump always chickens out, is this idea that he's never really serious about taking on China or making huge change, because as soon as there's a downturn on the markets, he runs for cover. And he did it again in the last couple of days, threatening 100% tariffs. And within 2 days, he was basically begging Xi Jinping to stop turning the thumb screws, which was sort of embarrassing and awful and just, the whole market sniggered at him and then just bought everything. So we're in an unusual place.
Well, so that's you warmed us up very well there. So we'll deal with that again in a slightly longer soliloquy and a bit more of a discussion about the markets, and also a discussion about why even the most ordinary investor, even in New Zealand, needs to really think about this, because even if you're a passive investor, you're being taken along for this ride and contributing to this extended ride. Is that all right, Bernard, if we do that? And the skateboarding dog, of course. Otago University, how lovely to see you.
Good to see you, Peter. Good to see you, Bernard.
Now, but I wanted to ask you about, I sent you an email about this. And I have a feeling I know some people who are going to react rather badly to what I'm about to say, but I found that entire performance at the Knesset with Trump, most of the media coverage of it, including New Zealand media coverage, but especially the BBC, which I don't normally criticize, and the Sharm el-Sheikh conference in Egypt with all these world leaders standing behind him rather embarrassingly. There's some fantastic footage of Keir Starmer kind of trying to get as close as possible to Trump and Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister. And my sense was that the whole thing was a load of old crap, that it was I referred to it in that note to you as a blowjob of Trump, which may be slightly disrespectful, but it was the most extraordinary sort of kingly performance. And his speaking to the Knesset the way he did and warning Israel that it had to find peace really made you think that Israel was now a colony of the United States.
Yes, but
Am I being too? Am I being? Let me put that into a question. Am I being too harsh, Robert?
I think you're slightly overplaying Mr. Trump's hand. I think Mr. Netanyahu, while he had to accept some things, some of his red lines he had to retreat from. I think essentially he took the view that Mr. Trump's attention span is not great, and he can take full advantage. And from Mr. Netanyahu's point of view, his Greater Israel project is not in danger as he sees it. And there's vague references, I think point 19 of the 20-point Trump peace plan, referring to the possibility of a Palestinian state, but it's vague on the West Bank. And Mr. Netanyahu's confirmed that he opposes a Palestinian state in any shape or form. And he's reiterated that since Mr. Trump has made his proposal. So what we're going to see, I think, in the second phase, if we can get there, of the Trump peace plan is a struggle for Trump's ear. Clearly, the countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey have thrown their weight behind it based on the assumption that Mr. Trump will take a more sober appreciation of America's wider interest in the region rather than simply lock himself in to unconditional support for Netanyahu. And here I agree with John Mearsheimer.
I was wondering. Good. I'm glad you've read him because I haven't.
On the Gaza thing.
Yeah.
Not on Ukraine.
No.
I think he's wildly wrong on that.
Yeah.
I think he is as wrong on Ukraine as he's right on Gaza. But he said on Gaza, he thinks if some of the countries supporting the peace plan are going along on that basis, they could be quite disappointed. He thinks that the leverage the Israelis have over the Americans is substantial. And he's hinted that he thinks that Netanyahu's government have leverage over Mr. Trump personally.
Yeah.
Which is probably the same sort of leverage that Putin has. And it may even be, well, in short, they may have some dirt on him that they can bring him to heel.
If they don't have it, Robert, then Miriam Adelson seems to, the wife of the former Las Vegas casino owner, who Trump effectively both thanked but also defamed to some extent in his speech into the Knesset the other day, because he had asked her the great question that Jews argue, rightly of course, as anti-Semitic, is whether she was loyal more to the United States or to Israel, because he thanked her effectively for putting so much pressure on him to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. Now, John Mearsheimer, who you were just talking about, of course, wrote a book, very controversial book several years ago, alleging that Israel was actually driving U.S. foreign policy.
Oh, it wasn't several years ago. I think it was about 2008, 2009. He wrote it with another excellent scholar, Stephen Walt. And I don't think it was particularly controversial. It caused controversy because it was speaking truth to power. It was meticulously documented. And it wasn't the most glorious episode in the history of Harvard University. Walt and Mearsheimer were contracted initially, commissioned to write an 18,000-page position paper on the Israeli lobby. However, when it was published under Harvard's name, it caused such a reaction from Harvard's wealthy donors that Harvard, within 24 hours, removed their logo from the paper, and they subsequently developed it. By the way, I read the 18,000-word paper, 18,000-word position paper or briefing paper. It was meticulously documented, over 300 footnotes, And they went on to write a powerful book. And the particular thrust of the book was that Mr. Netanyahu had played an instrumental role in getting the Bush administration to invade Iraq. Anyway, I think that Mearsheimer's position, to sum up, Peter, is that he doesn't think it will be possible for an American president, and particularly Mr. Trump, to abandon Netanyahu and order him not to pursue a greater Israel project.
Well,
and when you look at AIPAC's influence in the Congress, then I think Professor Mearsheimer's got a fair point.
And as you saw, when he left his chair at the Knesset, Trump referred to pardoning, that the Knesset should pardon, or the president should pardon Bibi. I mean, I also wonder, Robert, this, and again, I mean, without turning this into a sort of bullet point, I mean, of course, the release of the living hostages and some of their remains is a critical and remarkable development. But there's not a lot in this agreement that was not in the agreement that Bibi Netanyahu, or the truce that Bibi Netanyahu turned down nearly a year ago.
No, and I think it's been driven by, as we mentioned before, the attack on Qatar, the preemptive attack, which is the sixth of its kind, by the way, by Israel and neighbouring countries in the last 2 years. But I think Qatar, which hosts the biggest military base for the United States in the Middle East, look, I think the Emir of Qatar, backed by Saudi Arabia, gave Mr. Trump an earful, diplomatically speaking.
Absolutely.
And told him if he knows which side his bread is buttered, he better get on top of Netanyahu pretty rapidly. And I think this is his response. I don't think he was greatly moved by the fact that, in his words, America, because he admitted this in his speech in the Knesset, that Mr. Bibi kept ringing him up asking for new weapons, and he kept providing them. So he was tacitly accepting that he played a part in what could be construed as genocidal campaign in Gaza. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see how he's now placed in terms of the International Court of Justice,
which of course the United States doesn't recognize. But Robert, one thing that was interesting to see, it's the 20-point plan. I think when we had this conversation last week, it was a 21-point plan, and the one point that got dropped was Israel committing to not attacking Qatar again. I mean, Bibi covered that with a telephone call to the Qataris to say terribly sorry, but it was missing. And the other thing that's missing, and I was very surprised, well, not surprised, Marwan Barghouti, who people may have heard of, who is by far the most popular and credible Palestinian leader.
And charismatic.
Was moved from one prison to another and allegedly beaten up by his guards in a discreet place on the way, rather than being released. The Israelis have still refused to release him as part of this hostage release request.
Minister of the Israeli government.
Robert, we missed you for a moment there.
Sorry, I said that Barghouti was also photographed in prison on a video, or shown on a video, I should say, and he's in a much reduced physical condition, and he was publicly mocked by a cabinet minister, an Israeli cabinet. I think it was Ben Gvir. I'm not sure, but it was one of the hardliners.
Why should we care about Marwan Barghouti? Because Marwan Barghouti. Because it's so interesting that the Palestinian Authority was represented at Sharm el Sheikh, but there's really no reference to it, and no reference to it having influence over the international group that's going to sort of supervise Gaza. Hamas, of course, are a bunch of bastards who are quite literally shooting anybody that's getting in their way at the moment.
Yeah, but they don't have a monopoly on terrorism. State-sponsored terrorism occurs, and if you've been a Palestinian civilian, and 80% of the people killed in Gaza have been Palestinian civilians, well, they probably think they're on the receiving of terrorism as well. After all, 92% of residential homes have been destroyed, hospitals, universities, the place has been reduced to rubble. So, I agree with you. Hamas, they are a terrorist group, but they don't have a monopoly on terrorism. And the other thing to note here was, and this was the biggest omission in the Trump peace plan, there is no clear, explicit acknowledgement that the Palestinians have a political right to self-determination, which would, of course, help marginalise Hamas. And, let's be quite clear about this. Netanyahu only got worried about Hamas when Hamas attacked Israel on the 7th of October. Up till then, he was encouraging the Emir of Qatar to generously fund Hamas. He publicly said that Hamas was a public asset to Israel.
Because it was
his major objective is to keep the Palestinians divided. Unfortunately, there is no commitment to end the occupation, the elite, unlawful occupation, according to the International Court of Justice, of the West Bank, Gaza, and the East Jerusalem. And it's difficult to see how the Palestinians are going to be satisfied by what's emerging, and you can't rule out the resumption
Absolutely
of
not.
conflict.
Yeah. Bernard.
Robert, I'm keen to ask about what's happening with Ukraine, and in particular how the increasing use of apparently drones by Russia to harass Denmark and a whole bunch of other near neighbours and neighbours is changing the landscape in that conflict, and whether or not the trip to the United States by Vladimir Zelensky might change much at all in the next week or two.
Well, there's some interesting trends going on there. It was one of the things that struck me. A number of commentators, including John Mearsheimer, insist that Russia's the winning the war, but I don't think it is. And for a strongman leadership, it's interesting and that's how Putin sees himself. He's been completely defenseless, and that's probably the size of Russia, it being a factor, against these relentless drone attacks every night now by the Ukrainians against major energy infrastructure targets. One after another. There was last night as well. It's just going on relentlessly. According to one report, 38% of Russia's oil refining capacity has been lost in the last 3 months. Whether that's accurate, I don't know, but it was certainly in several newspapers. And what we do know is that Russian civilians are beginning to really experience the hardship of war. They can't get fuel from the petrol pumps in Crimea. That's being rationed in certain other Russian cities. And this is really critical for the Putin regime. Why? Because obviously oil helps fuel their invasion of Ukraine in supporting it. And secondly, it is Russia's biggest export. And so, what the Ukrainians are beginning to do is making inroads into Russia's life support system that enables the war to continue.
Robert, thank you so much for that. And I think I sent you a story that people should also track of the Kremlin identifying Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the former Yukos chief executive and rival of Putin, as a security threat to Putin, who was planning a coup. So there's been a whole bunch of fresh kind of claims put out by the Kremlin. So maybe that is a sign of some nervousness. But thank you very much, Robert. We're now going to deal with climate with Catherine Dyer, Dr. Catherine Dyer, forgive me, and Christina Hood. Bernard, take it away.
Kia ora.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you both, Catherine and Christina, to talk about a big week in climate news in Aotearoa. Firstly, Catherine, what did you think of the announcement on Sunday about New Zealand's changing of its goalposts on methane reduction, which has been in the wind, so to speak, for a while, but finally we got the news that the goalposts have been moved from at the end of the field to basically halfway up the field.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of trumpeted it in advance that was going to be coming, but it is quite disappointing, and I'm actually really keen to hear from Christina on this one, because this is something she knows a lot about, so I would rather have her have some more airtime on it. Yeah.
Go for it, Christina. What did you think?
Yeah, deeply disappoint, uh, deeply disappointing, but I guess, as you say, signalled. I think people had some last-minute hope when the official government projections came out 2 hours before the announcement, showing that we are on track to reduce methane emissions by more than 24% by 2050. We thought, oh, okay, maybe that's a sign. Maybe they're gonna hold, but no. And you would think if we're on track for 24% as of today's policy mix, that maybe someone between now and 2050 might be able to try a little bit harder and do a little bit more than that. So, yeah, targets are supposed to be something that you do stuff to try and reach, not the status quo.
Is it credible for the government to say, hey, this is what the science says? Look, we've got some scientists who said this. Does the rest of the world believe our GWP star or whatever it is?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting line. So the government actually already decided at the time of the election that they were going to go for a target which is no additional warming, which basically means that we will hold our warming impact at current levels. And then the only thing they asked the scientists was, well, what number would that correspond to? They didn't actually ask the scientists whether that was a good target, an appropriate target for New Zealand. So the claim that it's science-based is a bit of a fudge.
And what does the rest of the world think of this? Can we get away with it?
It's I guess wait and see. There will be, I think, a lot of scrutiny. New Zealand, the big international climate negotiations meeting is starting in a couple of weeks. So that's one forum. There's a meeting in Auckland next week with business looking at all of the benefits of the EU free trade agreement. So it's going to be really interesting to see if it comes up in that context, and that's another potential way in which there might be kickback because, as you might remember, European farmers were the constituency that was most against us agreeing this free trade agreement because they didn't want New Zealand produce coming into the EU if it didn't meet EU standards. And so I think there is a real question mark as to whether those European farmers might go to their governments and say, hey, hang on.
Catherine, I wonder too whether the farmers themselves are happy with this, because in theory it puts their trade relations with the EU and the UK at risk. And I do wonder if federated farmers in particular has gotten ahead of not just the farmers, but some of the big exporters in terms of their rhetoric and their view that, essentially the government shouldn't be doing anything to restrict production.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that federated farmers doesn't represent all farmers, and in fact, it's a much smaller proportion of farmers that it does represent than what it used to. I I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it's below 50% of farmers. And I think that there's a lot of the farming community that it's not been well represented by the voices that are speaking the loudest in the industry at the moment. I mean, I think there's quite a few that are interested in doing more and could do with more support from the rest of us to do that more. And the chances that they get that support going into the future to kind of get watered down the more that this divide opens up between what farmers have to do in terms of climate action and what the rest of us are supposed to do. And that's another question that I would have for Christina, actually, is about that. You know, what does it mean for the rest, for the emissions reductions and the rest of the economy that we have to achieve for 2050 if the farmers, if the agriculture industry is doing so much less in terms of methane?
Go for it, Christina. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's two options there. The first one is, yeah, thanks. There's essentially two options there. The first option is that we maintain our overall level of effort. We basically say, look, under the old targets, we were going to be responsible for a certain amount of warming. We will stick to that. We're not going to make things worse in the middle of a climate emergency. So if agriculture is doing less, then other sectors will do more. That is incredibly hard to pull off because methane is such an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. So if you were to try and compensate by reducing CO2 emissions, we would have to be net zero for all other gases immediately plus actually be net negative and pull back all of everything we've emitted since the Paris Agreement was signed 10 years ago. That's how much extra warming this causes. So that would be the kind of option of maintaining integrity. The other option is just to do less and just to say, no, we're weakening our targets, we're going to cause more warming. That's,
Christina,
that's our decision.
you've been doing this a long time and in some very politically testy times. We've often said on this show that we used to know who James Shaw was. It's very hard to remember Mr. Watts, the current climate minister, who's not in the cabinet. Are you expecting?
Yep.
Are you? I'm sorry, Bernard. Thank you. Thank you for correcting me on that one. Are you seeing this as a progressive slide towards either actually leaving Paris or accepting that Paris is no more, as really David Seymour is already, who's of course Deputy Prime Minister, is already pitching his perspective?
Yeah, I really don't see it getting that far. We've got a very strong position from the National Party that staying in the Paris Agreement is 100% in New Zealand's interests, and as long as that holds, you've got the very, very strong centre of Labour and National that will carry on and, broadly want to participate. Now, how that plays out with the relationships of, MMP coalition governments, this government and the next is, who can say? Hopefully, the National Party will feel strongly enough about this that they won't let the tail wag the dog on this one.
Christina, another bit of news in the last couple of days that didn't get a lot of attention, but I think is interesting, with my Treasury wonk hat on, is that the Treasury repeated in their end-of-year financial statements for 2024-25 that they are not going to cost up and include the climate liability for us having to buy a bunch of carbon credits to meet our Paris targets, essentially because there was no law that we had to comply with in the rest of the world that would force us to, which just seems extraordinary, given that we have signed the Paris Agreement and we seem to promise to the rest of the world that we're still in it. What did you think of Treasury doing that?
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of work on this topic, helping Wendy McGuinness out with the report that she wrote, and we actually pretty firmly established that you don't have to have a legal obligation to have a financial liability. There's a thing called a constructive obligation, which is basically when you're so far on the hook for doing something that you can't realistically back out of it, then you should be putting the money on the books. And when you read the Treasury papers from a year ago when they looked into this in response to Wendy's paper, basically the reason they didn't do it was, well, not really sure that we actually believe that the ministers are going to do it. That's kind of what Treasury said if you're reading between the lines. So
that's extraordinary. They're essentially saying we're above the ministry.
Yeah.
They're essentially saying we don't believe the law will be followed by the ministers we serve. That's what that says.
Well, it's complicated because it's international law, right? So it's like, well, what are the accountability provisions? How does that work? It's so it wasn't an extraordinary position from Treasury. And on the one hand, you have the government swearing blind that we're going to follow, our commitments and meet our Paris Agreement targets. On the other hand, ministers refusing to say that we will actually do the things that you would have to do in order to meet the targets. And Treasury kind of latching onto that second one and saying, well, ministers are not saying they're going to spend the money, so why would we? Yeah.
Christina, I know you have to nip off now, but I really appreciate you coming on to the show. It's fantastic to have you on, and I'm sure that this week's been very busy for you too. So
thanks very much, Christina.
Thank you. It's great. And it's great that you're able to stay on, Catherine,
Thanks
with
all.
us.
We'll see you.
Thank you, Catherine, for staying on, because there is...
Bernard, just so that Simon can maybe stitch it in again, just remind us what Christina is doing these days, because I think she's no longer at the university she was when she's been on before, right? What is she doing now?
Yeah, I've put a link to her LinkedIn profile in the invite to the Hoon today. She is an independent consultant who is has worked with various bodies in analysing our climate policy, and was at one point with the International Energy Agency. I think that's correct. And so, I would call her the most informed, independent voice on climate policy that we can talk to publicly in New Zealand.
Yeah. And Bernard, she was at Canterbury at one point. Is that right? We had her on from Canterbury.
Not sure.
No?
I think it's more sort of connected to Victoria University. But
Please go ahead, Catherine.
I would say though that if the listeners are on LinkedIn, they should go and look for Christina Hood there and follow her, because she comments a lot and always really well informed and detailed and knowledgeable about our climate policies, about the emissions trading scheme and how they operate. Really great source of information.
Yes. Now, Catherine, we also had the announcement today, actually. If it comes out on a Friday, the government really doesn't want anyone to see it. But they announced today their climate adaptation policy.
Thursday, Bernard.
Oh, Thursday. Well, in the new
there goes that anecdote.
Well, in the new post-COVID world, Thursday is the new Friday.
I wish. It should be.
Yeah. But you're right. I got my Fridays and my Thursdays mixed up. But it hasn't got a lot of attention, and it should, which is, for a long time now, our government and parties of both sides have said, hey, we should probably have a policy about how we deal with adaptation. Who's going to pay to move all these communities in places? Who's going to buy back the land, build the stop banks? Who's going to put in the trees? Who's going to do all these things so that the results of climate change are going to be understood and prepared for and paid for, and we don't just sort of make it up as we go along. And the ultimate idea was that at some point the government would have to say who's going to pay. And we were expecting that the government would come up with this, because both sides of Parliament have just sort of punted this one down the road. Catherine, what did we learn today from the government with its final response on this climate adaptation issue?
I'm not sure I'd call it their final response. Hopefully there's more to come, because what they released today is more in the nature of a pamphlet. So it's another one of those pamphlet responses. It's about 4 pages. It looks at a broad framework for subjects going forward. And I mean, I've got two kind of warring perspectives on this. One is that there is no doubt that this is a really incredibly tricky and difficult and contested subject, and so rushing into a final division of costs or whatever it is that people are looking for would probably be problematic anyway. And I think it's something that probably requires a pathway in terms of how we go about having more deliberation and more public conversation and debate about what we should actually do and how we should share out the costs. So I don't think this should sit just with one government. I think they should have a pathway that probably has a different pathway for short-term, medium-term and long-term responses, and that has some kind of deliberative, maybe climate assemblies in different regions and things like that built into it. That said, this is also a subject that both governments are going to be really trying to avoid making policy on, in case they get it wrong and it blows back on them, because it has so much potential to blow up in their face if they actually say this is how we're going to divvy it out and this is who's going to pay for it. So I think there's high potential for avoidance strategies and to try and punt the really hard decision making into future future governments. And that, of course, is problematic because the climate impacts are coming down the pipeline at us much faster and harder than we anticipated. And we also have an insurance industry that is busy looking at climate risk in a very different way to the way that the IPCC has looked at it through integrated assessment models. What that's essentially doing is repricing risk. And if that repricing happens too fast and hits us when we're not in ways we don't expect it to, then that could be quite destabilizing for the economy over time. And so that needs to be managed. That really desperately needs to be managed well, or in itself it becomes a transition risk and becomes potentially quite destabilizing. So this is tricky stuff. And I think that rather than just separating out, these are the four ways we're going to look at it at the moment, they need to have a pathway for how we're going to make decisions, and it needs to be agreed cross-party, so that it is something that we can travel down that pathway
doing that very well.
together.
Yeah. I mean, and to give you a sense of how sensitive it is and how the politics of it plays out. And we've just had a bunch of election results. We haven't talked about the local election results in the Hoon so far, because we can't cover them all. But there's one particularly interesting one. The Mayor of Bulla, Jamie Kleiner, who spoke at the Adaptation Futures Conference this week about what's happening with Westport and what happened to him. So he was in favour of a plan to move Westport, essentially, which is very vulnerable to rising sea levels and in particular floods because of the Bulla River. Move it basically upstream and away from risk, which would have been very disruptive and expensive. And he was he led the council that essentially agreed to this long-term plan. And of course, he was just kicked out by a bunch of voters who said, nah, climate change doesn't really exist or isn't going to happen, and I don't want to pay for it, and it's not going to happen to me. So he spoke about this at the Adaptation Futures Conference and basically made the same plea that you've just made, Catherine, which is, someone needs to step up and do some stuff right now because it's happening, and politicians should be leaders. There's the thing, no one's a leader. Everyone's afraid to essentially cross the climate deniers and the people who can easily shoot things down when they say, well, this will cost us money, can't afford it,
One of the things, that I learnt quite recently we had a guest speaker at the Critical Signals event called Doug Van Bell. He's a lecturer at Vic University, and he's talking about previous work that he's done in disaster risk reduction, and he said there's a few things that you need to have in place in order for effective disaster risk reduction to happen, but one of them has to be in place before the disaster happens, because you can't deal with it afterwards. And that's because once a disaster has happened, people are psychologically not in a position to talk about what they want from the future or what the next disaster will bring. The only thing they're focused on is getting back what they had before. So they want to be re-established in the position they were in before the disaster happened. So if you post-disaster want people's housing to be moved somewhere else or upstream, or you want some kind of change in the way that you manage things afterwards, you need to have those conversations before the big event happens. If you haven't got them bedded in, then good luck to you having them afterwards, because all you will get is pushback. So that really kind of says these are such important things to be talking about. We need to create forums in which people can have those conversations and really think about it when they're in a mental space where they can think about it and they're not just reacting,
Yes, and unfortunately, as the climate heats and tipping points are triggered and the storms get bigger and faster and more frequent, the space for us to have those conversations become more constricted. And also humans, I actually think, seem to be much more focused on the here and now and are much more aware of not losing things than they are about the long term and doing and gaining things in the long term.
I would say we know really well from experience with climate assemblies that when you put a group of people into a room and you give them expert information and time to talk about it and to deliberate, they are much, much better at thinking long term and making good, strong decisions about how we ought to respond as a society than the politicians are. That they make much more radical recommendations on the basis of that. So there are ways to manage that process so we get better long-term thinking, and it sits with people in the community. It doesn't sit with the government so much. So we need to find a way to get those sort of processes in place.
Yeah, the Citizens Assembly movement is very interesting. Key thing for me, I think, in that actually makes it more valuable. People go into a room together, there are humans in a single space together, and they all turn off their phones. And they are not having debates on Twitter or X or Instagram or TikTok or whatever. They're talking human to human. And that's why I think, Peter, we need to regulate the shit out of the social media platforms that should be subject to the Broadcasting Standards Authority.
Yes, Bernard. I don't agree.
So, Catherine, thank you very much. Lovely to have you on.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Catherine. Bernard, I think you've more or less screwed yourself as far as doing a session about the price of gold, which hit $4,100 this week. I was thinking about whether I could find the gold sovereign that my parents set aside for me when I was
Oh my
when I was
goodness.
born, along with the others. I don't know where the hell they got them all. I actually can't think quite where I've
Oh
got
no.
it put.
I hope you
Yeah.
haven't lost any Bitcoin.
No, I haven't got any. I never got any Bitcoin. I wish. Oh well, I do understand Bitcoin a bit, but I wish I had. But I also find it a frenzy. And of course, I did buy Oracle some time ago as an AI play, and that's gone very well. But it's not $100,000. It's only a few $1,000s. Now, do a fast soliloquy on what you want to say about the end of fiat money or the risks that this is all putting us in. Because the thing I wanted to say, Bernard, was just about that even if you're in an index fund, a tracker, low cost index fund, you are, at risk because, for example, the US market is driven by only 10 firms.
Yeah. And if they fall fast and in a big way, that's damaging, the central bank will step in and rescue them. And that's why whenever we see any sort of dip at the moment, investors jump in because they don't want to be the one who jumps out of the market and then when it rebounds much faster than everyone expected, they miss out on the next leg of the rise. What we have is a market now poisoned by moral hazard. And that's because for 25 years, the entire lifetime of most traders who are there now and most investors, they have seen that there is never a time when the rich lose their shirts because the government and the central bank will step in and rescue them, either directly, i.e. bailing out companies, but secondly, by just printing money and flooding it out there. And you do that so many times and people start to think, there's all this money that gets printed. I wonder if it's worth anything. And that's why we're seeing gold at, $4,200 an ounce. That's why Bitcoin is a big deal. And I think this goes to the heart of how we are as human society in a modern world. We are losing faith in the common things we believe in. And the most important, you could argue, in our modern economy, the most important common thing that we believe in is money, which we know now. And if you want to look at it in any depth, if you think money is real, go to your bank all at the same time as everyone else and ask for it back. That's always been a problem with modern banks. But secondly, we know that money is created by governments and by central banks and by banks, and it is not connected to any hard thing. It used to be up until the 30s essentially, and in a more direct way the 70s when.
So in a way, we're back to the gold standard, are we, Bernard? Without being attached to gold.
Well, we're about to see it tested. This is the thing. I think at the moment we're in a really precarious position where the stock markets in the United States are incredibly overvalued. They are in a position like we've seen in 1999, where an entire new technological layer of the internet as we know it is being built. It's enormously expensive. It's being paid by investors. This is the AI and data center build out. And when that happened in 1999 with the build out of the telecommunications network that underpins the internet, there were companies that blew up and some people who lost their shirts. But again, the market was effectively rescued again by Greenspan, who in 1996 warned about irrational exuberance, but then proceeded over the following years to bail out the market whenever he thought.
Bernard, just when somebody wants to check, are you suggesting everybody goes and takes their money out of the bank? Because that can be a little risky to broadcast that, especially when you're regulated by the Media Council.
No. I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying it's an interesting question to ask. Do we all have faith in the same thing these days? And why is it that the gold price is at $4,200 an ounce? And what happens next if the US stock market does take a tumble? And unfortunately, I'm arguing that there is a river of moral hazard that has poisoned our views about money and investment, and we are seeing the results of it now. I don't pretend to know what's going to happen next, but we should also be watching and thinking, because it's clearly there's a whole bunch of people, including central banks. This is the great irony, is that in the last 2 weeks, the share of reserve assets that is made up by gold has surpassed that of the share of reserve assets made up by US Treasuries.
Good Lord.
For the first time since not long after Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. And when central banks lose faith in US Treasuries, you've got to worry.
Let me check. Is that because of their increased holdings or because of the increased value of the gold that they already held?
Both. And a big chunk of the surge in gold values has happened since the Ukraine war, as central banks around the world, particularly Russia and China, but a whole bunch of others who are a bit nervous about someone blowing them up, have said, if I hold US Treasuries and the US government decides to use the financial system to lock me out of them, just like they did with Russia, I'd rather not hold US Treasuries. So there's been just quietly people are tiptoeing back from that and buying gold. Now, or Bitcoin. I'm not suggesting that's the way to go with either. I certainly still believe New Zealand dollars, but interesting things have happened in the last week. The Reserve Bank gave a speech in which it defended its money printing during COVID. Now,
yes, and said it wasn't so damaging after all. Is that right?
Yes. But at the same time, I published a mini Hoon earlier today with Arthur Grimes, who you could argue is the grand old man, the grand architect of our Reserve Bank Act, and was behind our hero status as the world's first independent central bank that targeted inflation alone. And he's saying in a major paper published today that our monetary policy system that he built, and he can't take the credit or the blame for what happened since it was built, effectively locked a generation or two out of our housing market, made some people very rich, made some people very poor, and it's changed the fundamental nature of our society in a way that makes it unequal, that has made it unhealthy, and which is driving 202 people a day to Australia.
And where can we read more about that, Bernard?
In a mini Hoon, which I published earlier today on the Kaka, which you're all welcome to.
And have you written it up though as well? Is there a story underlying it? I don't really like, videos other than ones with you and me in them. Is there a story where you say that?
Not in that way. So this is exclusive first for the Hoon audience. And over the next wee while, I'll be talking a bit more about whether our Reserve Bank still has a social license to operate in its current way, and whether independent central banks and our independent central bank and inflation targeting is all it's cracked up to be. I don't think it's made New Zealand a better place.
Why don't you run that interview through Otter or one of the translators and flick it up as a transcript? I think it's a really interesting topic. Thank you, Ben. Shall I do the skateboarding dog before our producer has a coronary on air?
We don't want that.
Yeah, so Donald Trump, it's about him again, and it's a little bit of a Bernard skateboarding dog because it's got a visual. But Trump has objected to a picture that Time magazine published on its cover in an otherwise, to my mind, ludicrously hagiographic package of coverage about the Gaza truce. And it shows him rather unflatteringly from underneath, and I'm not sure that anybody would want it, but he does look like a turkey. With a rather large sort of gobble. What did you call it, Bernard? What's that?
A wattle.
A wattle. A very large wattle. And so now there's a conspiracy about who allowed it to be taken and who allowed it to be published. And best of all, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, who is, as we know, kind of a pretty ghastly person, said only unhealthy people obsessed with malice and hatred, perhaps even freaks, could have chosen such a photo. So when you've got friends like that, what else do you need? Bernard, thank you very much for this week. You're looking great, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you very much. Ka kite anō. See you all next week, everyone. Bye-bye.